Hi everyone, I'm Lillio, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. Here, I'll be presenting joint work with Lou, Shilad, and Bahareh that was done at the Office of Applied Research at Microsoft. The study is all about how people meet across different time zones, so if you're interested, please stick around to find out more. Modern global organizations, like Microsoft, span multiple parts of the globe, and therefore different time zones. People often have to collaborate across these time zones and therefore synchronize in the form of cross-time zone meetings. Anecdotally, at least for me and the people I speak to, these meetings are often quite difficult both to schedule and to attend, but they're also really important to help us connect with a diverse set of remote attendees. And I think this feels especially salient in the post pandemic era when we all move towards a hybrid work paradigm. There's actually a rich body of existing work in this area, especially on cross time zone meetings, and they too highlight the difficulties but necessities of synchronizing across time zones. But there's still a lot more to learn. So this body of work is typically small scale and anecdotal, so there's a lot of empirical gaps in our understanding, particularly of, for example, whether cross time zone meetings are actually prevalent in practice. So in this study, we address three questions that help fill these gaps. First of all, to what extent are these meetings actually challenging in practice? Do they align or are they misaligned with workers' meeting preferences? Second, assuming that they are quite challenging, then who are the workers that have to take on this work? Is there an equitable distribution of cross time zone work across the organization? And finally, assuming that indeed these meetings are challenging and that they might not be equitably distributed, then what are the reasons for keeping them in the first place? How can they help us connect more diverse attendees from across the organization? So to address these questions, we used a mixed method study. First of all, we ran a large-scale data trace analysis of a sample of meetings that were conducted in the first half of 2022 at Microsoft. We then supplemented this with a survey. So the survey was informed partially by a set of exploratory interviews that were qualitatively analyzed, and it was designed to elicit participants' preferences and perceptions, not only of scheduling in general, but specifically also of cross-time zone work. We kept the calendaring dataset and the survey separate to protect employee privacy. So what did we find? Overall, it turns out that cross-time zone meetings are actually fairly prevalent. They make up almost exactly a third of all meetings and generally have more attendees. So employees, on average, can expect to see a lot of these events in their calendars. But are they challenging? Well, to figure this out, we asked employees in the survey to report their preferences for working hours and meeting hours. And while people are being more and more flexible about their working hours in general, they still prefer to meet within the traditional 8 to 6 p.m. workday, or the core of the day. So there are some very clear stated preferences here. And in practice, we do see that people schedule in this way. People tend to organize events within this 8 to 6 p.m. range. However, you can see that there's quite a bit of variance here outside of this range, especially for people that are outside of UTC-8 or the West Coast of the US. So this suggests that actually employees in remote time zones have something to do with scheduling outside this range. And when we look at these cross time zone meetings specifically, we see a very, very clear pattern. So compared to regular meetings of the same size, cross time zone meetings are much more likely to have an attendee call in from an odd hour outside of the typical workday from their localized time zone. So it's very clear, actually, that despite what people say are their stated preferences, that in practice, these meetings appear to be quite challenging as a whole. So given these difficulties, we also want to think about the people who have to take on these difficulties. And is this equitably distributed amongst the organization? And one way of thinking about this fairness issue is to look across the world and the different places that have employees in them calling into these cross-time zone meetings. To measure fairness, we use a standard Gini index that traditionally was used to measure, for example, health outcomes in the different regions of a country. And here, we're just modifying this to measure the distribution of cross-time zone work amongst the different employees in the country. And here's the patterns that we got. For the Gini index, the higher the Gini index is, the more it suggests that the distribution is skewed towards a smaller set of employees. And we do see that as we go further away from North America, that actually there's a higher amount of skew. So a smaller fraction of workers account for a disproportionately larger fraction of cross-time zone work. So this suggests that there could potentially be some inequities in how this work is distributed amongst collaborators. This extends even beyond individual geolocations and also to pairs of geolocations. So, for example, if people from the US meet with people from India, or people from Canada meet with people from China, these are the sort of examples that we're thinking about. And the full details are in our paper, but there are asymmetries too in pairs of geolocations. And in fact, if we go beyond geolocations and we look at the structure of the organization itself, so there are asymmetries between how organizers and attendees have to go to meetings, and also asymmetries between different organizational roles, from individual contributors to managers, for example. So all this also is in our paper. In summary, we do see some potential inequities in the structural asymmetric distributions across the entire organization and across the world. And what's really important here is that employees know about this. When we spoke to employees and we asked them in our survey, they said that they care about fairness when scheduling for remote attendees. This is very clearly a salient issue. Given these challenges and given these potential inequities, we should think more about why we have to keep these meetings in the first place. And anecdotally, we think that people who meet in these cross-time zone settings are bringing together diverse communication patterns. So how can we measure this in a data trace? One way of looking at this is to think about organizational distance and communication distance as well. So, for instance, if I were to meet with this person in the monitor and they were to meet with another person in the conference room, I should think about how far apart we are in our communication patterns. And I want to capture second and third order effects as well. So the full details are in our paper, but essentially what we did was we applied the word-to-vec algorithm to our meeting data. Very, very standard technique here. What that allows us to do is to place people and attendees in some sort of meeting space. And then within this space, we can look at the different meetings and see how far apart attendees are. So the closer attendees are, the more similar their collaboration contexts are. And the further apart they are, the more dissimilar they are, the more diverse the meeting seems. So when we look at our meeting trace, we see exactly what one might expect. People who meet across different time zones in these meetings, they tend to be more diverse. So these cross time zone meetings have actually quite a bit of effect compared to single time zone meetings of the same size. They are much more diverse and have people who have much more dissimilar communication contexts. And just to corroborate this, we use a second measure based off of the org chart. So people in cross time zone meetings are also much more likely to be further apart in the org chart in terms of their path than people in single time zone meetings. And yet again, we see that people in their open-ended responses were also very, very concerned about having these diverse viewpoints in cross-time zone meetings as a benefit of these meetings. I think there's a lot of empirical evidence here that actually these cross-time zone meetings are really beneficial as connective events for people to gather that are very diverse collaborators. So in sum, what we find is at scale, cross-time zone meetings are prevalent but challenging. And they're distributed in potentially inequitable ways. However, there's a lot of good reasons for keeping them, and we see here the first large-scale set of evidence that supports existing theories about connective events in cross-time zone meetings. And all of this, again, is salient to workers when they responded to our survey. So the question is, how can we balance these tensions in cross-time zone meetings to help foster healthier global collaborations? There are two things here. One thing is, in the literature, there's a lot of scheduling strategies that were suggested to deal with these cross-time zone meetings. And it turns out that when we asked people whether they were using them, that very few employees reported experimenting with these strategies. So there's a lot of space here, not only for individuals, but also for policymakers to encourage employees to try these strategies when scheduling for cross-time zone attendees, such as, for example, reserving blocks of time explicitly for distance collaborators. And I think it's really important also to think about the systems that we're using. So the systems that we analyzed, plus ones that people often use to schedule cross-time zone meetings, they are typically not informed by data. They would suggest hours almost as if they are all okay, except what we find here is not all hours are equal and not all hours are fair. So it's really important to guide the development of scheduling assistance using these sort of empirical analyses. So that's pretty much what our presentation is about. Cross-time zone meetings at scale are very challenging but connective, but there are plenty of ways of dealing with the tensions in these meetings. Thank you so much.